All right. So, this is the first video for AP Euro specifically. There'll be stuff in this video that I might eventually show to the AP World kids, although it's probably going to be a lot more detailed than they need. So, this is pretty much specifically just for AP Euro. Now, in AP Euro, we start at a specific time period. So we start in the year 1450. And so what we're going to do in this video is kind of go over what Europe looked like before 1450. So this stuff is our pre 1450 context. So what was going on in Europe in the years prior to 1450. And we usually use the year 1450 because this is kind of recognized as the beginning of the Renaissance, which will be our first major topic of discussion. So what we're going to do in this video and probably the next video is talk about what Europe looked like in the centuries and decades prior to 1450. So we're going to start way, way back with the collapse of the Roman Empire. So we're going to do a very brief overview of what Europe looked like after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So let's talk about the collapse of the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire collapsed in the year 476 CE. And when that happened, we get the creation of two Europes. So these two Europes are almost complete mirror images of each other. We have the poor, isolated Western Europe, which is mostly kind of made up of kingdoms, but just kind of in quotation marks, kingdoms of various Germanic and Slavic people. These are going to be the ancestors of the English, the French, all the different types of Germans, the Scandinavians, those people. You might also see some of the Slavic people in northeastern Europe, the precursors to the Russians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, all of those guys are kind of set up in these poor, isolated, quote unquote, kingdoms. The other Europe is the rich, centralized Eastern Europe. And when we think about what this is the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire is just the continuation of the Roman Empire. So this is just the continuation of the Romans, and they're going to keep going like this until 1453. So almost 1,000 years between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. The Eastern European part of the continent is going strong, basically continuing what the Romans did with law, politics, religion, all of that stuff is going to continue on in the Byzantine Empire, which is really just another name for the Roman Empire. Okay, So, because the Byzantine Empire lasts until 1453, they're not really going to be a player in our course. We're just mentioning them here because we've got these two different Europes. We've got the poor, isolated Western Europe and the rich, centralized Eastern Europe. So let's do a little bit more specific examinations of the different areas of Europe. So let's kind of divide Europe into, I guess we'll call them 4 quadrants, just to get a better idea of what's going on in each of these areas. So we'll talk first about, I guess, what we would consider Northwest Europe. So this is going to be your, what is now France, Great Britain, Scandinavia, I guess we could throw the Austrians in there. Northwest Europe, so kind of the northern western part of the continent. This is the best example of these fragmented kingdoms. Yeah, so we've kind of already talked about these guys. This is the best example of that. Okay, if we do northeastern Europe, so we'll just kind of go clockwise, and we'll talk about northeastern Europe. This is territory that is outside the Byzantine Empire. And these people are your Russians, the Polish, the Lithuanians. These guys are Christians, although they are Orthodox, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And for the most part, these guys, at the time we're thinking about, so kind of between 476 and let's say 1200-ish, these guys are kind of controlled by outside forces. Specifically, the group that we want to mention here are the Mongols. The Mongols are going to be in charge of this area, specifically the Russians. All right, so if we keep going, we'll talk about, I guess, southeastern Europe, and that's where we find the Byzantines, but also Italy. Now, Italy at the time of the collapse of the Roman Empire was in really bad shape, but Italy, after about 1200, kind of becomes the economic power of Western Europe. They're kind of the entrance to Western Europe. So we've got rich city-states control trade with the East. So think specifically China and India. So these rich city-states are starting to control the entry of goods into the rest of Europe. And so we're going to think about rich city-states like Venice, Florence, Milan, Genoa. Those are the places we're thinking about. Notice Rome isn't one of those places. Rome is kind of under the thumb of the Pope, who we will talk about at length later. But Rome is kind of its own thing. And then the last quadrant of Europe that we need to think about at this point is Southwest Europe. Now, Southwest Europe, I'm going to kind of isolate to just be the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is where we would find modern Spain and Portugal. Now, at this time, Spain and Portugal are part of the Abbasid Caliphate. They are really far away from the power centers of the Islamic world. So this area is actually kind of independent. And they have their capital at Cordoba. So Cordoba, around this period, remember we're kind of thinking of this like long, broad, like almost 1,000-year period before the Renaissance. Cordoba was the biggest, most influential city in Europe, and it was an Islamic city. So this kind of changes our mindset when we think about what Europe looks like. Most of Europe that we would think about as Europe is poor, fragmented, quote-unquote backwards, and the really rich and, again, quote-unquote cultured areas of Europe are places we wouldn't normally think of as being that. We've got Muslims in Spain, and we've got essentially what is Turkey, which when we think about Europe today, we don't think of it as being Islamic, and we don't really think of Turkey as being the centers of Europe. But in this time period, that's kind of what we're thinking about. So that kind of gives you an overall like 30,000 foot view of what Europe looks like at this point. So this is kind of a political look at Europe. Let's do a little bit of social stuff. By and large, unless you lived in the Caliphate or the Byzantine Empire, you lived under a social slash political slash economic system called feudalism. Okay, so feudalism is one of those kind of catch-all terms for what the Middle Ages looked like. It is a mixture of social stuff, political stuff, and economic stuff. What I'm going to draw here is a very, very rough approximation of what feudalism looks like. But it does kind of give you a sense of what a regular person dealt with on a day-to-day basis. So when we think about feudalism, and you've probably seen this before, especially if you took world history, but you've probably seen something that looks like this before. So I'm going to draw a triangle, and I'm going to divide it into 4 parts. At the top of this triangle is the king. Beneath this triangle are the nobles. Beneath the nobles are kind of minor or lesser nobles. You might even think of these guys as like knights. And then down at the very bottom are peasants. In this system, the king owns all of the land. And so the king gives pieces of the land to the nobles. Big pieces of land. Much more land than the nobles can deal with. So they give parts of their land to the minor, the lesser nobles, who then divide it amongst the regular people who live on the land, and they work the land. In return for being given a little piece of land, the peasants give to the nobles above them food, taxes, and military service. And that goes up the other side. So you can kind of see that this is a social, a political, and an economic system all rolled into one thing. So we get a political system because this is a system in which the king has power and kind of shares his power with the nobles and the lesser nobles, and finally the peasants. And in return for being given some of the land, we get some economic stuff, we get some more political stuff, and these are distinct social classes. So this system kind of works. It kind of works. It's stable to a point. So this system has some problems with it. But before we talk about the problems, it does have some benefits. It is pretty simple. It doesn't require a lot of effort to get this to work. And everybody gets something. It may not be a lot of something, but everybody gets something. The problems, though, is that there is no social mobility. You cannot, if you are a peasant, you are a peasant for the rest of your life. If you are a lesser noble, chances are you are going to die a lesser noble, and your kids are going to die lesser nobles. Maybe you could do something to become a regular noble, but there is very little chance that you are ever going to become king. So there is no social mobility to this. Additionally, because this is food-based, because this is all based on food, a drought or a famine of some kind can destroy the system. If there's not enough food to eat, you've got a problem on your hands. One more issue with this is that military service is compulsory, meaning you have to be in the military if they tell you you're in the military. So if you're a peasant, one day the guy who owns your land is going to come up to you and say, "Give me the pointy stick you use to farm. I'm going to give you a different pointy stick so we can go kill people with it." And peasants are not soldiers. So this can be a problem too. And we'll talk about the military more as we go forward. But there weren't armies. Armies arose when there was a war, and when the war was over, the army disappeared. And the reason for that is that wars are expensive, and you can't afford to keep that many people without paying them or feeding them. So you want them to just go take care of themselves. Now, I should also say that this system is very, very general. It's not going to look the same in every country. It's not going to look the same in every village. You could see a system that works one way in a village, travel 10 miles down the road to the next village, and see a similar system that works in a different way. But, like I said, it's also kind of stable. As long as there aren't any huge disruption to the system, it kind of works. So you will see feudal systems in rural areas in Europe into the 19th and even 20th centuries. In fact, most people in the regions that we're talking about in this course were farmers until the early 1900s. So even though this system is very unstable, it's also the system that kind of worked in Europe for most of its history. I'm going to stop this video here. In the next video, we're going to talk about the church, which is the other major tent pole holding Europe up. So if feudalism is one tent pole, the church is another one, and I want to make sure that we give enough proper attention to what the church looks like in this pre-1450 context. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.